All right, welcome everybody. Um, my name is Alex Hernandez, Mr. Hernandez to you. This is the first video that is meant to accompany our ACE U.S. History class, AS level, and this is where we start. Now, if you look at the Cambridge syllabus, you'll notice that the first topic that should open up the year is the topic of antebellum America, meaning the United States as she existed in the couple of decades prior to the Civil War, and paying particular attention to what drove the sectional wedge, particularly between the North and the South, that eventually would erupt in the event that most people recognize as the American Civil War. So this particular video is going to be a bit rushed, and I'm sorry if I don't touch on every detail. And it's also handle some uncomfortable topics, and I will try to address these as academically as possible. So let's start with this. Let's propose our proposition, our first proposition. If we're looking to understand, to get to the bottom of what truly was that force or those forces that drove sectionalism, the sectional wedge between North and South, that eventually erupted in the Civil War, there are two. Number one, the existence of the practice of slavery in the United States, particularly in the South, which quite often found itself in conflict with the reoccurring occurrence of territorial expansion. Every time we expanded territorially, the question emerged, does that mean we're also going to expand slavery? And from that question would begin the debate. One part of the country, highly invested in agriculture, said, yes, absolutely, let's expand slavery, whereas the other part of the country, already on the path towards growing a commercial economy, towards industry, rejected the idea, also on moral grounds. Usually, most often, some sort of a compromise was reached until eventually in 1860 there was no longer a compromise, and sectional tensions would eventually lead to a conflict that would decide the fate of slavery in this country. And that is the original sin of this country. The existence of slavery, and maybe it would not have been, I don't want the right, it would not have been that defining of an issue if it wasn't that we also professed to believe in, to champion very Enlightenment ideals about the individual, the rights of the individual, blah, 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 while at the same time practicing something that was a direct slap in the face to those lofty ideals that we professed to ourselves and to the world to believe in. And that's what caused the psychological stressors, if you will, that drove um, that sectional conflict, the obvious contradictions between what we said about all men being equal and the actual practice in that. No, um, we did not always, some would even argue till today, live up to those ideals, and that created stress. All right, so let's first get to the first topic. So let's talk about the issue of slavery. Unfortunately, slavery has been around since mankind has been around. This is true. In the context of American history, we tend to focus on the slavery that existed since the 1500s, and deservedly so, because it was of a particular character. Um, but slavery in itself, and how are we going to define slavery? Slavery is the state of being in which an individual finds their labor either forced or bonded to someone else with little of no choice of their own in the matter, and their freedom in, in this situation either being highly restricted or non-existent. Now, slavery existed since the first man was able to pick up a club and dominate another man. Probably the first examples of slavery that you've probably ran into in school and looking at history is slavery as it existed in the ancient world. But yes, it was quite widespread and commonly known throughout the ancient world. Asian societies practiced it, but the ones that we know of, the Egyptians, we know of the Jews that were sold into slavery in Egypt. That's even in the Bible. We know the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, um, Persians, even the Aztecs, and all these societies. Their primary source of labor was dependent on slave labor. In instances like Athens, you actually had more slaves in the city-state of Athens than you had freed men. Okay, so how do we distinguish between ancient slavery and the slavery that took root in the New World um, after the 1500s? Well, people found themselves primarily in slavery for one of three reasons. Either extreme poverty, and selling yourself, body, and your labor to someone else was a lot better than starving. So some people were so poor that slavery was the only way to prevent dying of starvation. They sold themselves to someone in exchange for food and shelter. Sometimes it was based on debt, which is pretty much the same thing. To pay off a debt, persons sold themselves into slavery. Sometimes slavery was used as a punishment for a crime. Prisons didn't quite exist in the ancient world, and so therefore, as a crime, sometimes a debt, they kind of connect to each other. Individuals were bonded to somebody else. Or most often, slavery was reserved for captives during a war. Um, the losing side, those that were not slaughtered, were taken captive and sold into slavery. So, regardless of the way to get there, slavery was quite prominent in the ancient world. But it was usually rooted um, in poverty. It was rooted either somebody was so poor that they had no choice, or they owed so much to somebody else they had no choice, or as a punishment to a crime, or most often they had been taken captive in war. And it was not necessarily a permanent state. It's very fluid. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes these slaves found themselves emancipated later on in life. Sometimes they were able to buy their own freedom. But their quality of life, their condition of their everyday lives, um, yeah, were that of a slaves. They were essentially the property of somebody else in that time, whether it be indefinite or if it had a definite end to it. So let's jump forward a little bit. So where do we find slavery? Let's say around the turn of the millennium, not the last one, the one before that. Because we're getting closer to, why Africa? Why Africans as those individuals that would end up supplying, the slave population in the Americas. And for that answer, we have to look at what was going on in the Middle East. Maybe around 5th, 6th, 7th century. Real short. If you remember your world history class, you'll know about the emergence of Islam at around the 5th century, and how Islam, through warfare, spread east all the way up to India, and west all the way up to the North African coast and Spain. And all empires require a large supply of labor. Um, the Arabs, who were pretty much the dominant group in the early history of Islam and its expansion, came to learn of Africa. And well, here's the thing. Slavery was just like it was in just about every continent on the planet. Slavery was a very old practice in Africa. Okay. Again, it was not rooted in the same justifications as the slavery we're going to see here in the New World. It was rooted in you were either very poor, or you owed a debt, or as a punishment for a crime, or taken captive. Same rules, same circumstances that we found in the rest of the world. Um, the Arabs, noticing there was a large supply of individuals that could supply the labor needed to grow a growing empire, and understanding that customarily, traditionally in Africa, this was still being practiced. They just continued it and expanded it, and they, through contacts they made in coastal communities that were better off than those in the inland. They started the trade in human beings. Now, Islam is going to have a difficulty because, you can't enslave believers. But it doesn't really mean anything. Just like Christians, Christians are supposed to treat fellow Christians, with brotherly love, and yet they didn't. Same thing here. Muslims are not supposed to enslave fellow Muslims. That's what the Quran said. But in practice, there were many instances. Many of these Africans had converted to Islam and would be sold into slavery nonetheless. And a lot of people don't know this, but the Arab slave trade not only lasted longer, but eventually would traffic more individuals out of Africa than the transatlantic slave trade. Over 15 million people estimated over a much longer period of time were trafficked out of Africa. Before we continue any further, make it real quick. And here's another thing. Slaves did not necessarily have to be privately owned. Sometimes they were purchased by the state, religious institutions, and they didn't belong to individuals, but they belonged to the state or religious institutions. The interesting thing to keep in mind, rather than just, just manual labor, the Muslims tended to enslave for very peculiar purposes. A lot of those slaves ended up either being soldiers. Yes, Game of Thrones is based on historical truths that existed in the past. Guards, domestics, and interestingly enough, concubines. Unlike the slavery, the traffic of Africans that would take place, in the New World, during the Arab slave trade, 2 out of every 3 of them were women. And to say it quite bluntly, the purpose was sex slavery, in the majority of cases. Um, and so we fast forward a little bit. We know the Arabs are trading in slaves, particularly along the coast of East Africa. So let's take a look at Africa this time. Very important. And this is, the outside world knew very little of Africa, very little about the interior. And what we did know, we knew a lot about North Africa because the Arabs were very much involved in North Africa for a very long time. And we knew something about West Africa. We knew there were kingdoms that were very well off along the west coast of Africa. And that's where we're going to draw our focus. Okay? And I want you to remember, take it real quick. Of all the countries of Europe, those countries that would possibly have the greatest amount of knowledge, not just knowledge, but the greatest lines of communication with the Muslim world, would be those European countries that were most impacted and closest to the Muslim world. It would be basically what today is Spain and Portugal. And what happens next is not an accident. It has to do with proximity and familiarity with the Muslim world that the rest of Europe simply didn't have. So around the late 1400s, so real quick, maybe some of you remember the birth of the Renaissance, right? And much of the wealth that fueled the Renaissance was in trade that was arriving in northern Italy through the Silk Road, through, the Middle East, which the Turks controlled by the time we get to the late 1400s. All right, so the Silk Road that started in China went all the way on, to the, the eastern frontiers of Western Europe, of Italy, And you had some city-states like Florence and Venice and Genoa that became incredibly wealthy, trading in goods from the East. And some of the countries in Europe further west decided there might be a way of circumventing the Italians. There was no Italy yet, and getting hold of those supplies um, and possibly at a cheaper price, having a direct supply route. So the Portuguese really start, pushing the envelope and dabbling in, very long distance navigation. And they don't want, they're still very risky, and so they hug the coast. But the Portuguese are the first ones that are able to go around Africa and establish themselves and establish trade with faraway places, even India or even, the Macau, the colony they set up in China. And this strengthens uh, the trade relationship. This kind of opens the door to more trade between Western Europe and Africa. And just like the Arabs before them, the Portuguese become familiar that in many of these coastal communities along Africa, human beings are still bought and sold. Unlike in Europe, the custom of slavery had disappeared. It was replaced with serfdom. But it was the custom of slavery was still alive in Africa, and the Portuguese would come to learn this as they traded more and more with the coastal Africans. Not only that, now they were able to get their hands on goods from the Orient and kind of circumvent the Italians. Well, right next to Portugal, we have a country that's also interested in doing the same thing. So now we're going to get to a well-known event that just about everybody should have gotten in their history class, 1492. And we all know the story of apparent Italian navigator, but that's debatable. Christopher Columbus approaches several countries with kind of a crazy idea. His calculations claim that the circumference of the Earth is much smaller than what all the greatest minds at that time believed. Forget the flat Earth nonsense. That didn't exist. Okay? What did exist at the time that they claimed the Earth had a particular circumference, and here comes Columbus, and he says that he did the math and it's actually smaller. It's so small that you could depart from Spain in a number of vessels of Portuguese design called caravels, and probably reach the others, the Indies within a couple of weeks. And the only country he's able to convince is Spain, and so that's exactly what Columbus does. And his math was off. The earlier calculations were correct. The circumference of the Earth was larger than what Columbus imagined. What saved Columbus is a landmass that nobody in the old world expected, okay, or even knew of, which one day would be called the Americas. Columbus did not land on the continent. What Columbus did was the first one that landed, first European ship that landed in what today is called the Caribbean and came in contact with the natives of the Caribbean, which broadly referred to as the Taínos. And what unfolded after that, um, and we only have so much time on this video, and I'd love to go further. What unfolded after that was nothing short than an apocalyptic event for the native inhabitants of the Americas. Many historians estimate that we had up to 100 million Native Americans throughout the continent, and within 100 years of Columbus's arrival, only 10% of them remain. And the primary reason behind that was disease. The Europeans brought disease that the Native Americans had no defense for. And so here come the Spanish. And they've been instructed, he got the green light to do this with very specific instructions in mind. Whatever lands you claim for the Spanish crown. Okay? Whatever gold you find is for the Spanish crown. In return, you will be made governor of the Indies and the admiral of the seas, and your children will get titles and blah, blah, blah. And you have to understand that religious fanaticism fuels much of what would be called the conquest, because you also have a religious and mandate to convert as many souls to Christianity as possible. I'm going to say this real shortly, and you can look it up yourself. Spanish society is unique at this time compared to other European societies. At this point in history, Spanish society had just emerged from the longest conflict in human history, the Reconquista that lasted 800 years, the war between Christian Spain and Muslim Spain. Yes, Spain was once a Muslim country, and it took 800 years for the Christian North to expel all of the Muslims out of Spain. But what did this leave behind? A society that knew nothing but conflict for 800 years. And a society that justified that conflict in religious fanaticism. Okay? Which borrowed a lot from the Muslims. The Muslim idea of jihad. Okay? Of spreading the faith. Okay? uh, through the jihad, through struggle against infidels. The Catholics copied that almost to the letter. And now their reconquest, their crusade was to expel the Muslims from, or infidels, non-believers, first from Spain, and then when they get to the Americas, you understand, in a mindset that the Spanish were in, if you're not a Christian, then you have to be on the other side. And if you're on the other side, there's simply no mercy for you. You're not even human. And if you're not human, what good is this gold for you? So the Spanish really quickly got to work at forcing the natives to mine gold. They began to enslave them. This goes all the way back to Columbus. This is why, the heroic figure of Christopher Columbus has been dealt some very serious blows in recent history. Because in his diary, he encouraged and promoted the idea of enslaving this population, taking advantage of how naive they were, and putting them to use for the Spanish to find gold. On top of other more serious, more adult-like, crimes that were committed. Listen, Columbus's crimes were known even while he was alive. Eventually, they placed him under arrest and sent him back to Spain for that very reason, for mismanaging the colonies. And so what happens to the Taínos at the hands of the Spanish is no less than an apocalyptic event caused by disease and then the outright genocide of whoever was able to survive that disease, because the Spanish wanted to make this land their own and take all the gold. Well, it didn't quite work out that well. The natives were able to escape the Spanish. Those that survived were able to escape the Spanish. But there's two things. The slave population that they had singled out is dying out in huge numbers. And those that don't die in significant numbers, they're able to successfully run away and hide. And the whole point is to build an extension of Spain in the New World. And you need a labor force to do this. It's not working out very well because this labor force is shrinking by the day. And then, of course, hey, you know who else still practices slavery? Africa. And the Africans already have exposure through the long Arab slave trade to the diseases of the West, and will be resistant to those diseases. And so we won't have to worry about a labor force of African slaves dying off to disease the same way the natives did. And so as the door closed, and it was transitional, to the use of indigenous Americans as slaves, the door opened to the use of Africans. And of course, it was going to come from the Portuguese and the Spanish because they had the greatest familiarity with the Arabs that had been doing it for centuries. And so they basically got involved in the practice of trafficking Africans out of Africa. 1518, is the first shipment of African slaves to the Americas. And not long after, and the island they're going to head to is Hispaniola, which is today is Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Friar Bartolome de las Casas begins to complain to the crown and complain to the crown and complain to the crown. In 1542, Carlos I, who was the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand, he's half Austrian through his father, passes a series of laws that begins to mandate no more slavery of Native Americans, particularly the ones that convert to Catholicism. And what does that end up doing? If you can't enslave the Native Americans, then what's going to happen? That's going to further increase the need to begin to ship even greater numbers of Africans to the New World to replace the Native American population. In 1552, Bartolome de las Casas writes The History of the Indies, which details how the Spanish abused the native population. But that's essentially how the door opened in the Americas. Um, it was through the decline of the Native American population to be used as slavery, the door opened to the use of African slaves being trafficked out of Africa. And now this begins our conversation on the transatlantic slave trade. And before we continue, um, what makes this instance of slavery different than what existed in the past? Here, you don't quite see slavery taking root as a means for people to escape slavery or as a punishment for a crime, okay? But more along the lines of people that were taken captive and then sold to others to be used for labor. And this also has another characteristic. And the concept of race didn't quite exist in the world back then because people, the vast majority of the human population, lived and died never seeing anybody different than you. And if you've never seen anybody different than you, then the concept of race has no usefulness. Only when the world begins to get smaller and people begin to grow an awareness that there are other people in the world that have different physical characteristics, does little by little a concept of categorizing people by physical characteristics, which we know of as race, which is a bankrupt concept, it's a social construct, does that begin to take root in the world? And it begins to take root and is used as a justification for the traffic and enslavement of Africans. And it occurred in a very similar fashion that the Arabs, the Europeans would show up along the coast. These communities, these kingdoms, were interested in what the Europeans had to trade, but the only currency that they had that the Europeans were interested in was human beings. So they would send raiders. It was not Europeans going into the interior, at least not in the beginning. They would send raiding parties to go into the interior, okay, to target small communities and villages of people that were defenseless, kidnap those people, usually young teenagers, more males than females, because the transatlantic slave trade wanted manual labor more than anything else. Would drag them to the coast and then use these human beings as currency to trade with the goods the Europeans brought with them. First the Portuguese, then the Spanish, and then the Dutch, and so on and so on. Most persons of African descent in the New World who could trace their ancestry back to slavery in the New World were of West African origin. That's another unique characteristic. Most of the slaves that the Arabs were involved in trafficking were of East African origin. In this case, they were West African origin, and almost always originating from communities that existed outside of those coastal kingdoms that existed at the time. In religion, there was a number of people that were trafficked that were Muslims. And right here, next couple of images we're going to go by pretty fast. So this is reiterates that most of the trafficking towards the New World actually originated in West Africa. Okay, those West African kingdoms served as brokers, as intermediaries between European slave ships, supplying those European slave ships with human beings in exchange for trade goods. And this is how we end up with something that was referred to as the triangular trade pattern, which lasted for 300 years. European ships would arrive along the coast of Africa. There are ships full of all kinds of trade goods, rum, textiles, manufactured goods, and guns in particular. Those kingdoms, pretty much the only currency that they had that the Europeans were interested in was human beings. So they would trade human beings in exchange for these, particularly guns, because if they were able to get their hands on guns, then that would give them the ability to kidnap and traffic even more human beings and sell them to purchasers on the coast. Slave ships would pack human beings for the Middle Passage. It was not uncommon for half of them to die because they were mistreated and abused and any horror, any possible horror you could think of. And the first destinations are the islands of the Caribbean and then eventually throughout the continent. And the primary purpose was manual labor, particularly in the production of agriculture and agricultural cash crops. And it was these very cash crops, sugar, tobacco, and cotton, that were therefore sent on to ships bound for Europe, sold in European markets, and then that money, would load up the ships with trade goods, and then the pattern would repeat itself. Infamous image of almost instructions on how to pack as many bodies into a slave ship as possible. And then the idea of race is now starting to gain traction because then the Western world has to now wrestle with how do we justify this? How do we justify calling ourselves Christian and at the same time practice this? And it usually boils down to, well, of course this is acceptable because they're not like us. They're not human. Okay? And this is the birth of white supremacy, right? When the group doing this justifies their action in a constructed sense of we could do this because something about us makes us better than the group that this is being done to, even to the point that are they even human? And this is how they are able to salve their conscience. Okay? More pictures. It's pretty much the same. Um, there's no shortage of accounts of how bad it was on these ships. And they would arrive here, and that's where the horror began. Families were torn apart and sold for the purpose of forced labor. They were abused, they were sexually abused. Violence became a common everyday occurrence to these people that were torn from their homes, from their families, from their villages. It was a traumatic experience, made all the more traumatic by being in a completely alien environment and being completely vulnerable to these people that have done this. Um, and this is a horror that black people across this continent um, are going to be subjected to uh, for at least 400 years. So one of the two things that distinguish ancient slavery from the slavery that takes root here, not one is it justified by this concept of race, which did not exist in ancient slavery, but by the emergence, not that it didn't pre-exist, of what we call chattel slavery. Not that it didn't exist in the old world, but that it became the norm. in the New World, that the slave was the property of the slave owner, and that slavery was passed on from mother to child. Add that to a sense of white superiority, that this was done and it was justified because the group doing it was somehow better than the group that was being done to. And it was this group of people and only this group of people that this treatment was reserved for. And that's what makes New World, the slavery that took root in the New World, by definition, very different. It was forever. It was chattel slavery. And it was defined by this emerging concept of race and racial superiority and inferiority on the other side. If we look at the destinations, you'd be surprised. The number one recipient, importer of trafficked persons would end up being Brazil, by and large. Why is that, Mr. Hernandez? Because the conditions of work were so brutal that life expectancy was extremely short. Hence, they needed to constantly import slaves from the Americas. Yes, Cuba. Yes, Jamaica. Yes, Puerto Rico. In fact, anywhere in the New World where you find a community of people of African descent, yes, slavery was once practiced there. And the larger that community, that tells you how much slavery was practiced there. And if you look at the United States, it's very interesting. Some of the lesser numbers on this graphic were actually slaves that were trafficked to North Africa. And yet somehow by 1860, they end up with the largest slave population in the Americas. And that's a conversation we're going to have at another time. And this graphic, just if you want to see some numbers. And that's going to be the end. I think we went over maybe a couple of minutes of our first video presentation. Replay it as many times as you want. There will be a quiz. And welcome to Cambridge ACE, AS level US history.